I guess he calls it potting, but he was arguing points that was like, bro, what are you trying to say to me, bro? Like just come out. You know what I mean? And he felt like that conversation was a little too sensitive, so he didn't drop the episode. Why didn't you drop the episode? Same conversation I had with Joe, Dame Dash had with Charlamagne. Joe has his way of doing things. I got my way of doing things. If it's that, then you shouldn't hide it. You shouldn't hide it.
But how you know it was that?
He was just really energetic about that time.
So you... Mav Hoffa exposes Joe Budden for his suspect behavior. Yes, on the recent episode of Good's podcast, the I Disagree podcast, Mav resurfaced some claims about Joe and their tumultuous relationship over the last few years. Everybody knows that Mav and Joe are kind of the big players in the field of urban podcasting. Mav's podcast is huge, but Joe Budden remains top dog in the urban podcast sphere. Still, the two have had interesting ongoings and back and forths that have occurred during their rise to the top in this field of podding. So, one of the most interesting things is that these two guys did an episode of Joe Budden's podcast. And in that episode, the two would clash seemingly about some type of gay discussion and, I guess coming out the closet. But it would get so heated that Joe Budden would decide not to release it.
I actually did battle Joe on his podcast.
Word.
And if you want to know the results, you could just go online and check.
It came out?
No.
Still, it's unclear why Joe didn't release it. And Joe has in the past said that he felt like Mav just didn't handle the conversation right and Mav seemed a little bit crazy. But Mav would contend that the reason that Joe didn't release it is because he cooked the hell out of Joe Budden in the argument and made him look crazy. Now, in this podcast with Goods, Mav is saying that he told Joe to come out the closet or something like that, and it got a little crazy. But that also happened on Mav's show when Joe Budden would sit down with him. Now, another interesting entrance into their journey together as co-workers or colleagues in the field is that the two would actually flirt with the idea of starting a podcast.
No, Flip plan was to do something with me, him, and Math. I deaded that because me and Math are too expensive. There was no point in doing that. And Math wants a deal. And I don't want no deal nowhere. So that ain't going to work.
Yeah, that's right. Remember Potter House? It was Queen's Flip, Joe Budden, and Mav Hoffa. Before Flip was supposed to join the Joe Budden podcast, he actually offered the idea of doing a podcast with the three of them. But Joe Budden would be the one to shut it down due to the fact that I guess it was like a negotiation issue and Mav wanted to bring it to a network. And Joe Budden likes to be super independent. And you can see in that clip there that maybe this is what led to hard feelings between Mav and Joe Budden. I even remember an Instagram live where Mav said something super corny happened with the negotiations. I do think Mav feels like Joe Budden did some tricky stuff and may have been looking at that situation a little bit odd. Now, another chapter in the exchange between the two guys is that Joe Budden would sit down with Bag Fuel. Remember Bag Fuel? They're comprised of the podcast Esso Heineken, and they were former members of My Expert Opinion. My Expert Opinion was a big-time podcast a couple years ago hosted by Mav Hoffa, and it was like at its peak with Esso, Heineken, Mav, Bigger, and it was like really at the top, but they would fall out over money issues and platforming and all of this other stuff. But when they would split, Joe Budden would sit down with them. Now, I'm not sure if that angered Mav, but I'm pretty sure it angered Mav. I don't think he ever said anything about it, but I don't know if he suspected that Joe Budden would join them. And it's interesting because after that, Esso and Heineken would have Saigon on the podcast, and he would diss his son. But I can't help but think that Matt Hoffa probably was like, look at you, Joe Budden. You went on that podcast and they had your op on there dissing your son. Now, as to how far things may go after this, I really don't know. I do find it interesting that Joe Budden hasn't been on the Math Hoffa podcast since. I know he's done it a bunch of times, so he probably doesn't want to sit down, but it seemed like they did that annually. But for it not to happen may just show that they're not on the best of terms. And as for Math, his podcast is rebounding a bit. It went through its own tumultuous incident with Gat Taylor. Remember, Gat Taylor was like more of a background character on the Math Hoffa show when Esso and Heineken and everybody left. He seemed to be holding Math down, but eventually they would fall out, and just like everybody else on the show, take shots at each other. But Gat did seem to try his best not to shoot, but once again, he would go on bag fuel, and that would seem to anger Math. Still, Math's barbershop now looks a little bit different. It looks, I'm not going to be mad at it because he probably just found a better situation. It doesn't look as prestigious as the previous barbershop, but you got to give him credit for at least trying to make something new of a situation. And I think he kind of does have the talent to bounce back. He has the ability to enter a wide range of subjects. And I do think he's a better interviewer than guys like Gilly, Wallow, and even Nori. That's the crazy part, is that Math is, to me, the best of the hip-hop interview podcasts that are at the top of the game. Now, I'm not going to say there's not other podcasts out there, but as far as $1 Million Worth of Game, Drink Champs, and My Expert Opinion, Math is the best because he's not as drunk as Nori and, acting weird, introducing these weird soliloquies that have nothing to do with the conversation. And he's not as corporate as Gilly and Wallow, who are kind of falling off, right? They're doing AI thumbnails. And also Gilly and Wallow is just a hip hop infomercial. Like, they just out there selling themselves constantly. And at least Math hasn't gotten to that point. But let me know what you think in the comments. Do you feel like Math Hoffa went too far, insinuating things about Joe Budden's sexuality? I mean, to be fair, there was a point where Joe Budden was playing into whether he was gay or not. Like, that was his thing. That was kind of his rollout. And even Flip would look at him weird. And now this kind of makes sense. Like, this episode that Math, Flip, and Joe didn't come out because there was a dicey conversation about all of that. And I'm interested in the episode coming out. I don't know why it ain't come out. I gotta be honest. The stuff that Joe talks about on his podcast, for that not to release, I can't see what could have said. And why was the whole episode scrapped? To me, that makes me think beef. There was some type of beef. The whole episode gets scrapped? Why not just take that out? Is it possible that Joe and Math just simply didn't get along that episode and it cutted the whole conversation to the point where Joe Budden felt it couldn't be released? This was like a couple years ago too, and we'll have to see how the two navigate their relationship moving forward because they're the biggest players in the game, and it's kind of interesting to see that Math has survived with all of the wild stuff going on behind the scenes. All right, y'all, with that said, follow me on Instagram, The Stop TV. Follow me on Twitter, The Stop TV. Once again, this all happened on Good's podcast, the I Disagree podcast. It was interesting. Let's see how long that podcast goes because the battle rappers, man, they always start a new podcast. It's like, man, they know that battle rap doesn't pay that much and battle rap is in a bad spot with only a couple leagues shelling out big bags. But, I mean, Goods has always done some type of content. And let's see if he's able to continue. Follow my Patreon. It's The Stop. There's a lot of stuff going there. There's a podcast going there. And I think you're really going to enjoy it because so much content is living on that platform. And I'm going to be doing a video about Queen's Flip. Something happened on the last episode of the Joe Budden podcast that I found particularly interesting. Why was Queen's Flip not there? Is something going on? And we're going to do the science. All right, y'all. This is Danny from The Stop. Peace.